She lay in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, hearing the hushed whispers around her. The doctors spoke in careful tones, their faces a mix of sympathy and uncertainty. Some said she'd never walk again. Others weren't sure if she'd even make it through the month. The accident had taken almost everything: her strength, her independence, her dreams. And for a while, she believed them. But what no one saw, what no one could measure in test results or medical reports, was the fire still burning inside her. It wasn't loud or obvious. It wasn't the kind of thing people could point to and say, "That's why she'll make it." It was quiet. It was the steady refusal to accept the life they predicted for her. It was the belief that, somehow, this wasn't the end of her story. The road to recovery was brutal. There were days she wanted to give up, days when the pain was unbearable, when progress felt impossible. Every small movement felt like a war against her own body. Every step, every attempt, every failure chipped away at her hope. People around her tried to be encouraging, but deep down, she knew some of them doubted her. She could see it in their eyes, the hesitation, the unspoken pity. Still, she pushed forward, hour by hour, day by day. And then, something shifted. One moment, she was struggling to lift her hand. The next, she was gripping the side of her bed, pulling herself up. The first time she stood on her own, even for just a few seconds, something inside her reignited. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about proving to herself, to everyone, that she wasn't done yet. Rehabilitation became her new world. What seemed impossible last week became her new goal. What seemed out of reach last month became part of her routine. She started to reclaim the pieces of herself that had been taken. And with every painful step forward, she realized something powerful. She wasn't just recovering. She was transforming. The person she used to be, the one before the accident, was gone. In her place was someone stronger. Someone who refused to be defined by tragedy. Someone who would go on to change everything in her field. No one saw it coming. But soon, the world would know her name. She didn't wake up one day, suddenly feeling stronger. It wasn't like a switch flipped, turning her into the person she was becoming. It was slow, frustrating, and often unbearable. The kind of progress that felt invisible until she looked back and realized how far she had come. Every morning started the same way. The early light spilling through the window, the ache deep in her muscles, the quiet moment before she convinced herself to move. Even now, after months of pushing forward, there was still that hesitation, the split second where her mind reminded her how easy it would be to stop. To just stay in bed, to let go of this impossible fight. But she couldn't. She wouldn't. The nurses noticed the change in her first. They were used to patients following routines, doing what was necessary, but never more. But she wasn't like the others. When they told her to move her fingers, she tried to move her hand. When they told her to stand for 5 seconds, she aimed for 10. She didn't just do what was required, she wanted more. There were days when frustration threatened to break her. Days when her legs refused to hold her up, when her body betrayed her, when the smallest task felt impossible. She wasn't immune to doubt. It crept in at night, in the quiet hours, when she was alone with her thoughts. What if this was all for nothing? What if she never got back what she lost? But she had come too far to stop now. The people around her changed too. At first, they treated her like someone fragile, someone on the edge of breaking. But now, they were starting to look at her differently. The hesitation in their eyes was replaced with something else: curiosity, maybe even admiration. She wasn't just recovering. She was proving them all wrong. Still, there was something deeper driving her. Something beyond just walking again, beyond getting her strength back. She wasn't fighting just to return to the life she had before. That life was gone. She knew it now. She was building something new. The world outside the hospital felt distant, almost unreal. She heard bits and pieces news from friends, updates about people she used to know. It was strange how life kept moving forward without her. But she didn't feel left behind. If anything, she felt like she was catching up to something bigger. There was one visitor who came often, someone from her past. Their conversations were short, careful, always circling around something unspoken. There was history there, something unresolved. She didn't know she had the strength to face it yet, but she could feel it coming, the moment when she would have to. And then one day, something happened. Something that changed everything. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of moment people made movies about. It was just a conversation, a simple sentence spoken in passing. But it was enough. Enough to shift everything she thought she knew. Enough to make her realize that her fight wasn't just about herself. It was about something bigger. Something she couldn't ignore. And for the first time since the accident, she felt it. The pull towards something greater than recovery. The words lingered in her mind, long after they were spoken. A simple sentence, casually said, but heavy with meaning. She replayed it, over and over, trying to understand why it shook her so much. It wasn't just about the accident anymore. It wasn't just about recovery. There was something else, something she hadn't seen before. She started paying closer attention to the people around her. The nurses, the doctors, the therapists, the other patients moving through their own battles. She noticed the way some of them avoided eye contact, the way conversations shifted when certain topics came up. There were things left unsaid, stories that hovered just beneath the surface. And for the first time, she realized that she wasn't the only one fighting something invisible. The visitors, someone she had known before all of this, became more frequent. Their conversations grew longer, stretching beyond small talk into something deeper. There were things they had never spoken about, things that had been buried under years of distance and silence. And now, it felt like all of it was beginning to rise to the surface. She didn't know if she was ready for that, but the more she tried to ignore it, the more it pressed in on her. There were questions she had never asked, answers she wasn't sure she wanted to hear, and a growing sense that something was being kept from her, something important. The physical recovery was one thing. That was pain she could measure, progress she could see. But this was different. This was about trust, about history, about everything that had been left unfinished before the accident turned her life upside down. And then came the message. A short, unexpected note from someone she hadn't heard from in a long time. It didn't say much, just a few words, but it was enough to send her mind spinning, because it meant that everything wasn't what it seemed. That maybe the accident wasn't just an accident. That maybe she had been asking the wrong questions all along. And now, there was no turning back. The message sat on her phone screen, its meaning sinking in slowly. It wasn't long, just a handful of words, but it was enough to make her pulse quicken, enough to confirm the uneasy feeling that had been growing inside her for weeks. She read it again, then again. Nothing about this had ever felt random. The accident, the way people acted around her, the things left unsaid. And now, this message proof that she wasn't imagining things. That there was more to the story. That someone knew something she didn't. Her hands tightened around the phone. A part of her wanted to pretend she never saw it. To go back to focusing on recovery, on the progress she was making. But she couldn't. Because once a door like this opened, there was no closing it. She looked out the window, watching the world outside move, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. She sent a reply, fingers hovering over the screen before hitting send. The wait that followed was unbearable. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, her mind racing with possibilities. Then, another message came. This time, a time and a place. She wasn't ready for this. Not physically, not mentally. But she had to know. The visitor noticed the change in her right away. Their conversations had been growing more personal, more honest, but this was different. She could see the concern in their expression, the silent question in their eyes. She didn't answer it. Not yet. Instead, she focused on what came next. The meeting. The moment that would either confirm her worst fears or prove that she was overthinking everything. The day arrived faster than she expected. She felt the weight of it in her chest as she left the hospital for the first time in weeks. The air outside was sharp and fresh, overwhelming after so long in the same sterile walls. Every step was slow, cautious, but determined. She reached the location, a quiet, unassuming place, the kind that most people walked past without a second thought. But the second she stepped inside, she knew she wasn't alone. The person waiting for her didn't look surprised to see her. If anything, they had been expecting this moment. And then they spoke. The first words out of their mouth made her blood run cold. Because everything she thought she knew about the accident, about the people around her, about herself, was about to change. She felt the air shift the moment they spoke. The words hit her like a shockwave, unraveling everything she had convinced herself was true. For a moment, she couldn't react. Her mind refused to catch up with what she was hearing. It wasn't just an accident. The realization settled in like a weight pressing on her chest. The late-night doubts, the unspoken tension in people's voices, the gaps in their explanations, it all made sense now. Someone had known. Someone had kept the truth from her. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her voice. Why didn't anyone tell me? The person across from her hesitated, their gaze shifting, as if deciding how much they should say. That hesitation made her stomach twist. There were reasons, they finally said, their voice quieter now. We didn't want you to. They stopped, exhaling sharply. We didn't know if you'd ever remember. Remember? Her breath caught. There was something she had forgotten. Her fingers curled into her palms as she struggled to piece it together. She had accepted that the accident changed everything. She had accepted the pain, the recovery, the way people looked at her differently. But now, she had to ask herself something she wasn't sure she wanted to know. What happened before the accident? A flash of something too quick to hold on to, too blurry to make sense of. A feeling more than a memory. Fear. Urgency. The sense that she had been running from something long before that moment. She stared at the person in front of her, searching their face for any sign of a lie. What aren't you telling me? Their expression hardened, and she knew, without them saying a word, that this went deeper than she ever imagined. She hadn't just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had been running from something. And whatever it was, it had finally caught up to her. The silence between them stretched, heavy with everything unspoken. She could feel it now, memories hovering just beyond reach, fragments of something important, pressing at the edges of her mind. She had spent so much time focusing on recovery, on moving forward, that she never stopped to ask what she might have left behind. Her voice was unsteady. What was I running from? The person across from her didn't answer right away. Instead, they exhaled, like they had been carrying this weight for too long. Then finally, they said it. You already know. A sharp chill ran through her. And then, like a dam breaking, it all came back. The night of the accident. The argument. The feeling that she had been watched for weeks, always looking over her shoulder, knowing something was wrong but unable to prove it. She hadn't just been in an accident, she had been escaping, trying to get away from someone. Someone who didn't want her to remember. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Who was it? The hesitation in their eyes told her she already knew the answer. And when they finally said the name, everything inside her went still. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't some faceless threat from the past. It was someone she trusted. The realization sent a cold wave through her, and suddenly, the recovery, the quiet doubts, the way people had avoided telling her the full truth, it all made sense. They had been protecting her. Or maybe they had been protecting themselves. She felt her breath shake as she stood up. I need to see them. The person in front of her hesitated, then nodded. The meeting was inevitable. She had spent so long rebuilding herself, but this was the final piece, the confrontation that would determine whether she had truly taken her life back. When she finally stood face to face with them, they didn't look surprised. If anything, they looked relieved, like they had been waiting for this moment just as much as she had. And then they spoke. "I was hoping you wouldn't remember." Her stomach tightened, but she didn't waver. Because now, she did. And this time, she wouldn't run. She stood there, staring at them, the weight of everything crashing down on her. For so long, she had been searching for the truth, convinced that knowing would set her free. But now, standing face to face with the person responsible for everything, her accident, her fear, the missing pieces of her memory, she realized that the truth wasn't just something you found. It was something you had to decide what to do with. She took a slow breath. Why? They didn't look away. Because you were never supposed to know. The words sent a shiver through her. She could see it in their face, the guilt, the regret, but also something else. Resignation. Like they had already made peace with whatever was about to happen next. For so long she had imagined this moment. She thought she'd feel anger, maybe even revenge. But now, standing here, she only felt tired. Not weak. Not defeated. Just done. "I remember everything now," she said, her voice steady. "And I'm not afraid anymore." They didn't argue. They didn't try to defend themselves. Because they knew. This was over. She turned and walked away, each step feeling lighter than the last. The past no longer had control over her. She wasn't the same person who had been lying in that hospital bed, wondering if she'd ever get her life back. She had rebuilt herself, piece by piece. And now, she was stepping into something new. The people who had been there for her, who had watched her fight, fall, and rise again, were waiting. The visitor, who had stayed by her side. The nurses who had pushed her forward when she wanted to quit. The people who had doubted her, but now looked at her with something different in their eyes. She had spent so long thinking recovery meant going back to who she used to be. But she wasn't going back. She was moving forward. There would still be challenges. There would still be moments of doubt, of fear. But now, she knew she had something stronger than any of that. Herself. As she stepped outside, feeling the fresh air against her skin, she let out a slow breath. This wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning.